The avoidance relationship with a super empath becomes a source of profound regret, not because the love wasn't real, but because it was too real, too transformative, and too threatening to their psychological defenses. Loving a super empath forced them out of their comfort zone in ways that felt like psychological violence, showing them what genuine love could be while simultaneously proving they weren't capable of sustaining it. The regret isn't about the love itself, it's about discovering their own limitations through someone who embodied everything they couldn't be. The super empath exposed their emotional poverty. Being loved by someone with unlimited emotional capacity forced avoidance to confront just how emotionally impoverished their own inner world actually was. The super empath's natural abundance of love, compassion, and emotional intelligence made their own emotional limitations glaringly obvious and shameful. This exposure created constant comparison where they felt like emotional children next to someone operating with advanced emotional sophistication. Every interaction reminded them of their own deficits, creating shame about their inability to match their partner's emotional generosity and depth. The regret includes wishing they had never experienced what true emotional abundance looked like, because the contrast with their own emotional scarcity became a source of constant self-hatred and inadequacy that they couldn't escape or resolve. The super empath made them feel their own wounds. Super empaths have the ability to create such profound emotional safety that avoidance carefully buried trauma begins to surface involuntarily. Being with someone so accepting and healing forced them to feel childhood wounds they had successfully numbed for decades. This unwanted healing created overwhelming emotional experiences they weren't prepared to handle. The super empath's presence acted like emotional surgery, bringing suppressed pain to the surface for healing in ways that felt torturous rather than therapeutic. They regret loving someone who made them feel their own pain because the emotional awakening was more traumatic than the original wounds. They preferred numbness to the overwhelming feelings that the super empath's healing presence inevitably triggered. They became addicted to something they couldn't sustain. The super empath's love created an addiction to emotional experiences, deep connection, unconditional acceptance, spiritual intimacy that the avoidant couldn't reciprocate or maintain long term. They became dependent on something they were psychologically incapable of sustaining. This addiction created a psychological hell where they desperately needed something they couldn't handle receiving. The super empath's love felt like emotional heroin, intensely needed but ultimately destructive to their psychological stability and defensive structures. The regret includes recognizing that they became addicted to a level of love and connection that required them to be someone they weren't capable of being, consistently creating internal conflict that felt impossible to resolve. The super empath revealed their capacity for cruelty. Being loved by someone so pure and generous made the avoidant's own capacity for emotional cruelty more apparent and shameful. The super empath's consistent kindness highlighted every moment the avoidant chose selfishness, withdrawal, or deliberate hurtfulness. This contrast created unbearable guilt about their own behavior patterns. Every cruel action felt magnified against the backdrop of their partner's unwavering compassion, making them see themselves as fundamentally flawed and possibly evil. They regret loving someone who made their own darkness so visible and undeniable. The super empath's light illuminated their shadows in ways that created self-hatred they couldn't escape through their usual rationalization and denial strategies. They lost themselves in someone else's emotional world. The super empath's intense emotional field was so powerful that avoidance felt their own identity dissolving into their partner's emotional landscape. They experienced loss of individual identity in ways that triggered their deepest fears about psychological annihilation. This identity merger felt like drowning in someone else's emotions while losing access to their own psychological territory. The super empath's emotional intensity was so overwhelming it felt like being consumed rather than loved. The regret includes wishing they had never experienced love so intense it threatened their sense of individual existence. They preferred the safety of emotional isolation to the terrifying experience of merger that super empathic love creates. The super empath made them want to be better. Being loved by someone so emotionally evolved created constant pressure to grow, heal, and become worthy of such love. The super empath's example made them want to transform themselves in ways that felt impossible and exhausting. This growth pressure created internal conflict between who they were and who they felt they needed to become to deserve their partner's love. The gap between their current self and their potential self became a source of constant inadequacy and frustration. They regret loving someone who inspired them to be better because the effort required to change felt overwhelming and the risk of failure felt too dangerous to their already fragile self-worth. They became vulnerable to devastating abandonment. Loving a super empath forced them to open their heart in ways that made them vulnerable to the deepest possible pain if that person ever left. The more they received unconditional love, the more terrified they became about losing access to it. This vulnerability felt like emotional suicide because they had allowed someone to become essential to their psychological survival. The super empath's love became their life support system, making the possibility of loss feel like guaranteed annihilation. The regret includes opening their heart so completely to someone that losing them would feel like psychological death. They wish they had never risked becoming so dependent on someone else's love and presence for their emotional stability. The super empath saw through all their defenses. Being with someone who could read their emotional reality accurately made it impossible to maintain their protective facades and psychological defenses. The super empath's intuitive understanding stripped away every wall and pretense. This emotional transparency felt like being psychologically naked and vulnerable in ways they couldn't control or manage. They lost their ability to hide, deny, or minimize their feelings because the super empath could feel everything they were experiencing. They regret loving someone who could see through their defenses so completely because it forced them to confront their authentic emotional reality when they preferred the safety of their protective illusions. They realized what they were capable of destroying. The super empath's pure love made them realize the magnitude of what they were destroying through their avoidant patterns. They could see clearly that they were damaging something precious and irreplaceable through their own psychological limitations. This awareness of their destructive capacity created unbearable guilt about hurting someone who deserved only love and care. They watched themselves damage someone pure while being unable to stop their destructive patterns. The regret includes recognizing they were capable of destroying something beautiful and sacred through their own dysfunction, creating self-hatred about their impact on someone who had never hurt them. They couldn't match the super empath's love. Perhaps the deepest regret comes from recognizing that despite receiving unlimited love, they couldn't reciprocate at anywhere near the same level. The super empath gave everything while they could only offer emotional crumbs in return. This inability to match their partner's emotional generosity created shame about being fundamentally defective as a loving partner. They felt like emotional parasites, taking far more than they could ever give back. The regret of perfect love. The ultimate regret is that loving a super empath showed them what perfect love looked like while proving they weren't capable of sustaining or deserving it. They experienced their ideal relationship while being too damaged to maintain it. They regret loving the super empath because it was simultaneously the best and worst thing that ever happened to them. Perfect love that revealed their own imperfections so clearly it became a source of constant torment rather than joy.